As Ed has said, a liberal education is one that is meant to liberate the mind. It's been a tradition at the U of L since the beginning, and our philosophy is built around several pillars. First of all, breadth across different disciplines, connection and integration of ideas and looking at things from multiple viewpoints across different disciplines. Also to emphasize the skills of critical thinking, of looking at evidence and arguments, unpacking assumptions, and making informed decisions. And all of this comes together in the last pillar or aspect, which is civic engagement. So the reason that we're teaching and learning and working at universities is, in the long run, to make the world a better place, to use the breadth, the multiple viewpoints, the critical thinking skills that we hone here to work for the good of all. And I'm sure tonight's speakers are going to share some of those themes with us. Thank you.
It's my great pleasure to introduce our two speakers tonight. Before I do, just an announcement that there is a reception following tonight's lecture. So following the lecture and the Q&A, there will be some food outside, a cash bar as well. So, without further ado, Enright Walsh is a writer, editor, and critic who has been the editor of Border Crossings magazine since 1993. She has written essays for books, catalogs, and magazines on a wide range of artists, including Robert Frank, William Wegman, Charlene Doyle, Robert Longo, and Moira Davey. She is editor of the Winnipeg Alphabetiary, the book accompanying a commissioned group of works now in the collection of the Winnipeg Art Gallery. She also wrote the 57 artist entries in the book My Winnipeg, which accompanied the exhibition at La Maison Rouge in Paris. In 2012 and 2013, she was a nominator for the Scotiabank Photography Award. This year, she is a juror for the 2015 Sobey Art Award. Ms. Walsh sits on the executive of Plug-in ICA and was a member of the Board of Trustees at the National Gallery of Canada. She co-curated Winnipeg Now, the inaugural exhibition for the Winnipeg Art Gallery's centennial year, and edited the book that was published in 2013 and to which she contributed an essay. In 2015, she contributed an essay to the book Wonderland, which accompanied Sarah Ann Johnson's survey exhibition at the Contemporary Art Museum in Raleigh, North Carolina. She is a contributor to Phaidon's Vitamin D2 in 2014. She is a recipient of the RCA, Royal Canadian Academy, Gold Medal for contributions to the arts. Robert Enright is a critic, broadcaster, and teacher. He's a contributing editor to Border Crossings magazine and holds the University Research Chair in Art Criticism in the School of Fine Arts and Music at the University of Guelph, where he teaches in the graduate program. He's contributed essays, introductions, and interviews to a number of books and museum catalogs in Canada and the United States. He is a member of Scotiabank Photography Award Jury and has been a nominator and contributor to Vitamin P2 and Vitamin D2, both published by Phaidon. His books include Body Heat, The Story of the Woodward's Redevelopment, Eric Fischel, 1970 to 2007, second edition, and, I'm sorry, I can't read this, Peregrinations, 32 Conversations with Contemporary Artists. In 2012, with Enright Walsh, he co-curated Winnipeg Now, the inaugural exhibition I mentioned a second ago for the Winnipeg Art Gallery centennial year, and contributed 12 interviews to the accompanying book. In 2016, he's curating an exhibition of the paintings and drawings of Melanie Authier for the Thames Art Gallery, which will travel to 6 Canadian cities. It is my pleasure to introduce Robert Enright and Enright Walsh.
Is this on, Robert? Yes.
It is now.
Okay, good. And, thank you so much. We're delighted to be here, and we are really looking forward to talking with the Lethbridge audience and the University of Lethbridge. A presentation in 2 voices requires some explanation. While not a fugue in that there are only two instruments. We will, it is hoped, develop our theme contrapuntally, responding and urging our thesis or talk to a coherent conclusion. We'll use examples from border crossings and other sources as well, but we see the magazine as the embodiment of our idea of the generative imagination. Border Crossings operates independently as a not-for-profit arts organization does, independent of the constraints of market engagements or the homogenizing or normative effects of an association with a large institution like a museum, a corporation, or a university. We will have some slides, some images that relate to the content of our papers, and they'll begin about 15 or 20 minutes into our talk. Before we proceed, I wanted to say, speaking autobiographically and also about border crossings, that I am here unburdened by the constraints of an extensive theory-rich education, having only an undergraduate liberal arts degree. In this way, untrammeled, I've been able to respond with border crossings intuitively, personally, quickly, and with some kind of foolish courage. Why not publish a magazine that looked at everything from everywhere? In Winnipeg, on the prairies, in the middle of the continent, nothing obstructed our view or ambition, except maybe isolation and those limited financial resources. Out of this has come a publication we hope is inventive, we believe is unique, or at least sufficiently iconoclastic not to be mistaken for anything else, which aspires to be honest and direct, and we would wish has made a contribution to the larger world of art and ideas where we have been privileged to work. I'll come at my presentation elliptically, recognizing the incomplete grammatical construction that suggests, because the gap, the space that is emptied or left, is exactly what I want. So some comments on a liberal arts education, ideas which are at home here at the University of Lethbridge. Martha Nussbaum is a distinguished professor at the University of Chicago and author of a number of books on education, human rights, and the law. Not-for-Profit, Why Democracy Needs the Humanities, written in 2010, is a pragmatic look at a liberal arts education, as the title suggests. She identifies essential qualities associated with the humanities and the arts as the ability to think critically, the ability to transcend local loyalties and approach broad issues as a citizen of the world, and to imagine sympathetically the predicament of another person. By this, I assume she means empathy, the absence of which Dr. Robert Hare lists as one of the key identifiers of the psychopath. Empathy, he suggests, is a necessary element of psychic wellness. It is Dr. Hare, UBC Professor Emeritus, who drafted the Hare Psychopathy Checklist as a diagnostic tool. Excuse me. Educators, Nussbaum argues, who set a course for economic growth alone will see the arts as unnecessary, and in fact as impediments to productivity. She quotes the Indian educator Rabindranath Tagore and cites him as a mentor. In his work, he had cautioned, among other dangers, that aggressive nationalism needs to blunt the moral conscience and requires for its success people who function as docile bureaucrats. Art is the great enemy of that obtuseness, Nussbaum says, and artists are not reliable servants of any ideology, even a basically good one. They always ask the imagination to move beyond its usual confines, to see the world in new ways. Marketable outputs of a quantifiable nature are a boon to bureaucracies, and increasingly so, even in assessments required in universities and cultural funding agencies. Ask anyone who has been faced with filling out an intractable form which disallows elaboration or individual responses. No one would question Martha Nussbaum's credentials or intentions, but I did pick out her very pragmatic focus, seeing a liberal arts education and the developed imagination as tools for the achievement of democracy, and her reminder of the necessity of being a citizen of the world as only a trace narrow. Our approach is to see the enrichment of the imagination as its own achievement. It can, of course, function independent of moral behavior, but its moving in the realm of abstraction would at least allow that value's consideration and inclusion. I find more persuasive the literary and cultural critic George Steiner's description of an education in the humanities at the University of Chicago, where he had received his undergraduate degree many years before. His description was, for me, the equivalent of the music of the spheres. One could want nothing more, I thought. In his 1997 literary memoir, Errata, An Examined Life, he wrote, "In the critical mass of a successful academic community, the orbits of individual obsession will cross and recross. Once he has collided with them, the student will neither forget their luminosity nor their menace to complacency. The student may well come to reject the discipline in question, the ideology proposed. He or she may head with relief toward an altogether mundane, middling way of life. He or she may fail to take in the best of what is being taught, or the philosophic scientific debates around him or her. More often than not, he or she may feel threatened by the mental powers, by the celebrity, be it hermetic or far-flung. No matter. Once a young man or woman has been exposed to the virus of the absolute, once he or she has seen, heard, smelt the fever in those who hunt after disinterested truth, something of the afterglow will persist. For the remainder of their perhaps quite normal, even undistinguished careers and private lives, such men and women will be equipped with some safeguard against emptiness. In its breadth and diversity, their education will have, at the very least, validated the place of the imagination. As Steiner wrote, however their lives unfolded thereafter, the possibilities the imagination will have presented should hold them safe against a deadening interior void. I suggest this held space is where immanence resides. As Border Crossings editor, I have focused on foregrounding two elements, or ideas, notions, things that I feel are essential. These are the artist's voice and good writing. Society, certainly highly regulated societies, find art makers in all disciplines frightening. Institutions respond to them as though they are alarming. This unruly bunch of thinkers who say and make and do the unexpected, almost pathologically taking risks where no material gain is guaranteed. They are the scourge of bureaucrats and administrators for whom they refuse to line up, settle down, and be counted. Just check Kafka on this. But they don't frighten us, and if they do, then we need to be upended and unseated, and we'd better pay attention. I'm just fine with the ideas and words of artists, unmediated, unfiltered by interpretation and explication, which accounts for the persistent presence of interviews on the magazine's pages. Who else do you want to hear from on contemporary art than the makers themselves? None of them somnambulists producing art as if it were ectoplasmic emanations. They are thinking, hard-laboring, anxious, self-examining, and never complacent about outcomes. Visit an insurance company, Canada Post Offices, any federal regulatory agency, or the service department at some outlet of a North American chain store, and test my assertion on artists and complacency. So the artist's voice. The other key element for me is language. I'm certainly not eschewing the place of the writer or critic. The magazine's goal is to communicate, to make connections. If the writing is irrelevant or so arcane that it becomes a private club, then its exclusivity certainly won't engage interested, intelligent readers who also want to make connections. Language has to be the carrier. In the writing I publish in the magazine, I look for critical soundness. The writer has to have researched and be solid on the subject being presented and the point of view being argued. Those are assumed criteria. And then I'm interested in writing that shows confidence in the idea of subjectivity, not ego or self-centeredness. What I'm speaking about is the courage to step forward in an individual way, to back an idea, an assessment that the writer thinks has merit and deserves attention. I set these requirements for the writing that I publish and hold myself to them as well. It's our intention that what follows will elaborate how our interest in the immanent domain is manifest in Border Crossings.
The title of our talk, The Immanent Domain, is a lift, a repurposing, and a riff on the title of a fine book published in 1969 and written by the distinguished literary scholar Richard Ellman. The book was called Immanent Domain, Yeats Among Wilde, Joyce, Pound, Eliot, and Auden. And as its title indicates, it was a reading of the relationship William Butler Yeats had to the generation of literary modernists of which he was a part. It considered how one writer found ways to use the language of his close contemporaries. Ellman uses as his frame the legal concept of eminent domain, the procedure by which a government can legally seize private property for public use. His domain is literature, and the writers he cites enjoy various positions of eminence within it. I want to read a pair of short sections from the book that address the question of influence and the practice of literary appropriation. The best writers expropriate best, Ellman writes. They disdain petty debts in favor of grand, authoritative larcenies. And later on, he characterizes the younger writers who perform these larcenies not as genial successors, but as violent expropriators, knocking down established boundaries to seize by the force of youth or of age what they require. They do not borrow, they override. This reading of the eminent domain recognizes the way the literary past plays into the present, but our naming asks for other and different associations. We're shifting from eminence, an arrived at state, to imminence, a not yet achieved condition. Art is the about to happen in light of the already having happened. It is a measuring of the influence of tradition and how the past is used in the ongoing, relentless present. Picasso was uncompromising in his insistence on living in the moment. All I have ever made was for the present, with the hope that it will always remain in the present. To me, there is no past or future in art. If a work cannot live in the present, it must not be considered at all. The road artists negotiate is a pavement of citations, sometimes admitted, at other times unacknowledged or obscured. In 2003, the Swiss performance artist and painter John Armleder said that young people are still lifting and recycling. They just don't care about the sources. So they have another kind of freedom. It's a liberation I'd rather avoid. I want to be transparent in admitting our intention and procedure. Anyone with an astute ear for modern writers and poets will hear deliberate echoes of lines that belong to them and not to us. Writing is an inescapable exercise in oral collaging, and I intend my writing here to be both method and application. Elusive writing, both heard and spoken, gets to have the best of both worlds. It relies on what has been said, but aspires to say something different with it. It's Spengler in reverse. Rather than the same things differently, it's different things partially the same. I think it's also important to be clear about what we aren't saying and what is our recognition of the condition of the imminent. It is not what Lyotard describes as nostalgia for the unattainable. The state of imminence is not a failure or a disappointment. It is not what artists settle for because they're incapable or reluctant to go after some kind of transcendence. Nor does our sense of imminence go as far as does Henry James, who seems enthralled by an eschatology of doubt. Our doubt is our passion, he writes, and our passion is our task. The rest is the madness of art. So we're engaged in neither the romance of nostalgia nor with some kind of errant romanticism. If we're involved in any philosophy at all, it's a material pragmatism. Our vision comes out of looking at the procedures and production of artists. Ellman's book and his recognition of the existence of violent expropriators performing grand larcenies anticipates the anxiety of influence, a theory of poetry, a contentious book written by the literary critic Harold Bloom and published in 1973. Bloom's argument was that great writing was a burden because it provoked either a crippling anxiety, outright denial of any influence whatsoever, or among the best writers, deliberate misreadings as a way of clearing an imaginative space for themselves. It's important to point out here that when I say writer or painter, I could as easily be talking about composer or filmmaker or choreographer and performance artist. But let me suggest a different and more positive way of relating to the question of influence. What if the achievements of earlier and even contemporaneous writers were generative and not paralyzing? It's a question the novelist and essayist Jonathan Lethem responded to in his essay, The Ecstasy of Influence, published in Harper's Magazine in 2007, in which he tackled head-on the implications of inheriting a weighty literary tradition. The subtitle of his essay was A Plagiarism, and while that might give you a sense of what he was up to, that might not give you a sense of what he was up to, it provides no measure of his ingenuity. His title, clearly a response to Bloom's book, was essentially an intricate collage of thefts. Every line was taken from an already published source, every one of which was acknowledged in a detailed section of footnotes at the end of the article. Lethem made minor changes to the borrowed lines, but for the most part, his list from this diverse collection of sources remained intact. What was remarkable was the coherence of his patchworking. The Ecstasy of Influence had about it an impish perversity, the kind of thing you would do if you broke into the Mint or some high-security institution just to show you could do it. But its message, if not its methodology, is a liberating one. The past and the tradition that comes with it can be understood, absorbed, and then be reused in ways that are quite different from their original employment. The past isn't a trap, it's a springboard. Nervousness isn't its governing emotion, exhilaration is.
I confess to be drawn by temperament, interest, and practice, when I can manage it, to imminence, a state of imminence. Its irresistible pull is the capacious, endless possibility, the expansive potential of what could take place or be produced. It is atemporal in that it is limitless, a breath or a sustained chord, a lengthy, elaborated narrative or a single if. Its apprehension can be readily quoted or close and subtly perceived. It seems to me generous and graceful and finds its fullest utility and expression in art. Here is imminence. In 1984, British critic John Berger published a small book of essays, musings, criticisms titled "And Our Faces, My Heart, Briefest Photos." It was personal and critical and immediate, the way much of his writing is. I read it in 1985, have almost committed it to heart where it resides, and thank him by attempted emulation for providing a form of critical writing that has shaped my own and my editorial approach to border crossings and any other work that I do. Here is a portion from a piece called "Once in Oxon." He has mailed a small parcel to his lover. He wrote, "In the post office, I saw in my mind's eye your fingers untying the knot I tied in Oxon. 10 days later, I again stopped in town and went to the post office, this time to post you a letter. I remembered the day when I sent off the parcel, and I felt a twinge of loss. Here is imminence. Yet what had I lost? The parcel had arrived safely. You had made soup with the beetroots, and the bottle of distilled water from the flowers of orange trees you had placed on its shelf above your dresses in the cupboard. All that had been lost was the little future of the parcel. That is imminence." In the most recent issue of Border Crossings, we talked with writer and actor Steve Martin. He is co-curating an exhibition of paintings by Lauren Harris titled "The Idea of North," a body of transcendental works from the decade 1920 to 1930. But this wasn't the first time we talked with him. 15 years earlier, we'd published a 3-part conversation with Martin and painters Eric Fischel and April Gornick, Martin as a passionate collector and Eric and April as fine painters. They were also close friends, and we called the interview "The Pleasure of Their Company." Steve Martin's first novel, Shop Girl, was about to be published, and he gave me an uncorrected proof as a gift. It's a delicate, finely drawn piece of writing, simply put, heartbreaking, and I wrote a short essay about it as my border notes to open that issue of Border Crossings. In the piece, I included American photographer Gary Winogrand's body of work, "Women Are Beautiful," photographs where women are glancing back or leaving, and I noted that he had captured the poignancy of the elusive, fleeting, missed encounter, and wrote that it's here, in the missed meetings and longing, that longing and possibility are sustained. I think that could be imminence. I also brought in the Canadian poet Anne Carson from her book Plain Water, and how she says that even in the pain of leaving, there is some consolation. It is simply in the fact, as you go down the stairs and walk in the dark streets, simply the fact of my eyes on your back. The characters in Shop Girl are an older man, Ray Porter, and a sad and beautiful young woman named Mirabelle. In my essay, I said, I think Ray Porter is inclined to the fragment, the splintered, incomplete entity, because while he believes he seeks propinquity, there's something else he wants too. He wants immanence, and wholeness doesn't take you there. He wants wanting, because that, for some people, the people I referred to earlier, art makers among them, is the sustaining goad, the restless feet that pace the mind in lieu of wanton gestures. It's the what happens next, in part, that Anne Carson answers with her eyes on your back. It's the arrhythmic heart that syncopates in anticipation and slows when the goal is achieved. It's the nevermore that makes Winogrand's photographs work. That's also immanence, longing, wanting, waiting, and the space those states imply.
It's important to say off the top that we're not advocating a position that argues the futility of art's aspiration to say something. Quite the opposite. We see meaning as manifold and manifest. Even when art is simple, it can carry the weight of its essential reduction. In this regard, I've always marveled at Yeats's The Circus Animal's Desertion, published in the Late Poems in 1939. What can I but enumerate old things, he asks. His question is a profound one. How does one escape the trap of repetition, especially if the venture has been successful? His answer is that you have to perform a radical reorientation. So he reduces his poetic repertory company, the players and the painted stage of his beloved and intricate Celtic Renaissance, and dismisses them in cadences that are perfect in their casualness. I sought a theme and sought for it in vain. I sought it daily for 6 weeks or so. Maybe at last, being but a broken man, I must be satisfied with my heart. Although winter and summer till old age began, my circus animals were all on show. Those stilted boys, that burnished chariot, lion and woman, and the Lord knows what. The poem goes on to ask what was the origin of his now abandoned masterful images. Out of what did they begin? And his answer is a scuttle of fragments, a mound of refuse or the sweepings of a street, old kettles, old bottles and a broken can, old iron, old bones, old rags, that raving slut who keeps the till. And then comes the poem's final 2.5 masterful lines. Now that my ladder's gone, I must lie down where all the ladders start, in the foul rag and bone shop of the heart. Yeats's garbage heap of fragments was personal, but in a larger context, it was also modernism's inheritance. It's useful to remember that two of the most important poems of early modernism, T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland and Ezra Pound's Cantos, are attempts to put the Humpty-Dumptied world of the 20th century back together again. It was a world whose Attic grace had been replaced by the barbarous clangor of a gong. So the project coming out of modernism necessitated some kind of rebuilding or reconstruction. I prefer the word reformation because its plastic quality is a good fit for someone who writes about painting, and also because to reform is to both shape and to change perspective. I'm clearly using it outside the frame of ecclesiastical history. In 1934, Ezra Pound named a book of his literary essays Make It New, and in the naming coined a phrase that would set in stone modernism's direction. Modernism's search for newness was a question of the then becoming the now. Pound's own recognition was that major poets keep together and arrange and harmonize the results of many men's labors. One procedural arm of modernism's strategy, then, was the gathering, arranging, and harmonizing of the labors of the past. Similarly, in Four Quartets, T.S. Eliot encouraged us to take into account both the new world and the old one made explicit. I don't want to be misunderstood. This is not a disguised attempt to reestablish an old way of making art, whether in poetry, painting, or sculpture. What it is, though, is an attempt to be as rigorous as possible in discerning what we can use and what we can abuse of the detritus, Yeats's mound of refuse, inherited from the rubble of modernism. It is telling to note that in the drafts and fragments of the cantos, Pound wrote, "My errors and wrecks lie about me. I cannot make them cohere." So why is modernism so important? I think precisely because it's the place where the most ruptures in the social, aesthetic, and political order occurred. And the place of most rupture is also the place where the most innovative and radical moves towards reforming can occur. It is the place of maximum imminence. As Leonard Cohen says, the crack that is in everything is where the light gets in.
We're reading immanence to mean an open and capacious way of coming at art making and thinking. In trying to explain or draw it, I see among its component parts ideas, imagination, which we have already mentioned, but never, of course, by its very nature comprehensively, and metaphor. Metaphor is the condition of one thing being recognized as another, and in that shift is the potential for immanence. Thinking about our topic, the idea of translation and reading between the lines has also entered, all of it about the space of possibility, that eternal what if. Artists guard the space as well as mining its transformative potential. I recall the American essayist Annie Dillard cautioning against committing memory to paper. Memory is another familial component of immanence. And in the territory of memory as material, Winnipeg filmmaker Guy Madden is the master. Dillard said that once you transform memory to text, it is no longer mutable. Memory's expansive, elaborative, and immanent qualities have been fixed to the record, fixed to the page. George Steiner celebrates what I see as that elastic space of reading between the lines. He questions the application of theory in reference to the humanities, arguing instead that our responses are elaborative, personal, intuitive, and narrative. In his book Errata, he argues, In a perfectly rational and pragmatic sense, a serious act of signification, verbal, imaged, tonal, is inexhaustible to interpretive summation. It cannot be anatomized or held in a fixed place. Each and every reading, in the larger sense of the term, each and every hermeneutic critical mapping remains provisional, incomplete, and possibly erroneous. I see his provisional and incomplete as an in-between space, allowing a gap into which possibility can slip. His position is that even the most acutely equipped, able, and informed reader in approaching any work of art will come only so near. It is into this potentially transformative so near gap that art makers reach to engage historical precedents and tap and build from ideas already manifest. In The Afterlife of Ecstasy, Jonathan Lethem refers to this kind of space as the eternal intertextuality of the cultural participation of reading, writing, making things from other things. We can think here too of Walter Benjamin and his assertion that translation is reading the interlinear, is reaching for a meaning, that translation is reading the interlinear, is reaching for a meaning that even exceeds the original. And if you say Benjamin, the idea of the threshold springs to mind with all the possibilities, the prevarication, a virtual buzz of hover and inaction, that uncommitted space where hesitancy is a kind of gift. All the possibilities are there before you make any move. Thresholds also imply a two-way gesture, stepping back, reaching back, retracing, and borrowing from what has already transpired, as well as that pause before the foot extends beyond the putative lintel. I wonder if we could have the images now.
You should know, too, that the images, while they refer to a lot of the artists we've talked about already and will talk about, are not in a kind of order that correspond to what we're saying. So in one sense, you have to also construct as a kind of thing in both listening to us and looking at the images. Mika mentioned Guy Madden and memory, and then Walter Benjamin and the threshold. I want to pick up on that in-between space and go back to Madden and his filmy sense of the past. He's the closest thing in contemporary filmmaking to a poster postmodernist, in that his films are one long footnote on films already made or films that someone thought about making. His Heart of the World, a 6-minute and 19-second long virtuoso short, is his haiku to the epic history of filmmaking. The film was made for the Toronto International Film Festival in 2000 and is a technical tour de force, using over 600 edits, that's 100 edits a minute, to retell the story of Kino cinema's glorious and inspirational past. Heart of the World was Eisenstein in a blink. You could say Madden was only a man with a camera eye, but what an eye. It won a Genie that year in the Best Short category, as well as the Best Experimental Film awarded by the National Society of Film Critics. But in his most recent feature, The Forbidden Room, co-directed with Evan Johnson, and it's going to receive its Canadian premiere this year at TIFF, after it's screened at both Sundance and the Berlin Film Festival, he's produced his most remarkable cinema excavation yet. Not a religious man, but a high priest in the low encyclopedic church of degraded film, Madden adopts as his mantra a verse from John, verse 6, chapter 12. Gather up the fragments that remain, that nothing be lost. Madden and Johnson are fastidious and outrageous in their preservations. They have poached, adapted, and invented a cornucopia of lost and forgotten films. The Forbidden Room is totally elusive, and no less elusive for its intricacies. Like Eliot's The Wasteland, they have made a world out of fragments. Let me offer a section of the plot and a few of the characters involved. The film wraps itself in the kind of rhizomatic storytelling used by the French writer and darling of the surrealists, Raymond Roussel. About halfway through the film, we're in a train compartment somewhere between Berlin and Bogota, after having seen the pelvic X-ray of a motorcycle-riding adventuress named Gong, who's been treated by the anchorite brother of a bone specialist, who, while waiting in a park to propose to her, is kidnapped by a trio of sexy insurance defrauders dressed in skeletal leotards. The doctor remains loyal until the toxins from their garments are transferred to the leotard in which they have dressed him, at which juncture his resistance finally breaks down. The intertitles flash the word bones in ever-growing letters, as the doctor remembers the 47 bones he lovingly and ineptly set on Gong's body after her devastating motorcycle accident. Bear in mind, this is only one small segment of a narrative that runs for almost 2 hours and that includes 16 films from 10 countries. Madden's sense of imminence is a kind of mesmerizing and hypnotic tease. Just when you think you've found your narrative feat, the story slips off in another and completely unpredictable direction. Interestingly, the film concludes by collaging a myriad of smaller endings, some connected to the storylines, others totally disconnected from them. They all anticipate some other event, and the effect is to defer any sense of conclusion or narrative resolution. Some of the quickfire scenes are magical, while others are menacing. It's worth remembering that one shade of meaning imminence takes on is a threatening one. Imminent danger is a horse and buggy conjunction.
I'd indicated earlier that I would draw on subjects we'd looked at in border crossings and attempt to explain what I think is the nature of their inhabiting the imminent domain. I'll start with Canadian photographer Moira Davey, who lives and works in New York. She is both photographer and writer, and one form parallels the other in their spare clarity. The book I focused on, Long Life Cool White, Photographs and Essays, held both and had just been published by Harvard University Art Museum. This was in 2008. The images in the book are domestic, cloistered, and private. Photographs taken in her apartment, which it seems, given her intimate cataloging of detailed, close-looking, could be an endless source, a universe of material. Even though the subjects are quotidian, they are more than enough, and are in no way constrained or limited. Beautiful indeed is the photograph of her dog's foot in a bed of house fluff, about which I'd written, as formal as the pediment of a Corinthian column is the furred paw in Paw, which has captured under its pads and toenails a sizable cushion of gray dust and hair, the hairs acting as extending light filaments for the camera. And this was only a canine foot and some house dust. Her book's lead essay is titled Notes on Photography and Accident, which I remember as holding off on fixed assertions, including in its provisional words like while and might and nevertheless. In the book, she identifies writers who are significant for her and an interesting and compatible quartet: Walter Benjamin, Janet Malcolm, Susan Sontag, and Roland Barthes, and draws on their insistence on the value of the inherently surrealist, contingent, bound quality of the vernacular photograph. My goal, she wrote, is to reclaim this critical history of ideas in relation to contemporary photographs and to understand how this notion of accident might still be relevant. I read her holding a space for the accidental, her courting contingency, uncertainty, the possible, as a space that could be identified as imminent. It's her selecting to photograph at the moment when a certain light gilds the dust clusters on the wide, honey-colored floorboards under her bed. For me, as a prairie dweller, it is a horizon and landscape, flat fields dotted with occasional clusters of trees. Or a frame from her video, 50 Minutes, held long enough that dust motes adrift reminded me of Rodney Graham's very beautiful film installation, Rheinmetall Victoria 8, where a 1930s typewriter is slowly obliterated by flour sifting from above to cover it like a slow and silent snowfall. When I read her essay, I picked out its elliptical quality, a tack I'd identified when I began this talk as one I take myself, seeking the spaces it implies. Davy is with Barthes and Benjamin, who name a desirable photograph as one in which a small accident makes a place for the viewer to enter. Her concern about digital photographs is the absence of deferral, the space or hesitancy that interrupts the action and apprehension, what she calls the phenomena of latency, contingency, and accident. She's in pursuit, she says, of the notion of the latent image.
Dana Schutz is one of the most important young painters of the post-9/11 generation. In Being a Nothingness, South wrote that to know is to devour with the eye. Using that measurement, Schutz is omnivorously knowledgeable. There are eyes everywhere in her paintings. Hers is an art of constant questioning. She continually asks herself, if one thing were done, what would be the consequences? What if there were only one man left in the entire world? What would he do? What if people ate themselves? What would they look like? Then what would appear if they put themselves back together again? If you painted various versions of God, what form would he or she or it take? Her most recent imagined scenario is that the world has ended many times over, and she's assigned herself the task of reconstructing all the art she found, based on the information that was left. Engaged in an activity where extreme art history crosses over into paleontology, she sets about studying cultural remains to begin the painstaking work of remaking art. This process would have some relationship to a memory of what existed before, but it would also be its own kind of art. There would be something recognizable about it, but more often than not, its content and look would be unfamiliar. Simply put, it would be new. Making new paintings is something Dana Schutz does particularly well. Every critic who's written about her work refers to her originality. Jonathan Safir-Foer describes her paintings as being like babies without navels. They have ancestors, but bear no mark of their heredity. He's right about the originality, but not about the aesthetic parthenogenesis. In spite of their capacity for self-consumption, they haven't been able to entirely eat their own navels. What makes Schutz such a fascinating painter is that you can actually see who she has looked at, and in that recognition, you're able to appreciate the full measure of her uniqueness. You can see how she adapts cubism in the painting and drawing called Girl on a Horse, both done in 2014, the drawing after the painting. In the oil on canvas, the girl is wearing blue riding breeks, teal on one leg and dark blue on the other. Her upper body sports a flesh-colored dressage shirt with gathered sleeves and a prominent white collar. The collar tends to accentuate the line of her cleavage, the fulfillment of which is interrupted by the head of her mount. The wild-eyed look on her face, implied fleshiness, and aggressive frontality remind you of de Kooning's Woman and Bicycle from 1952. Schutz's rider throws up her arms in the kind of gesture children use to show they're riding a bicycle with no hands. In the drawing version, the horse's body is rendered as a cascading arrangement of compressed cubes, cones, and highlighted edges, as if a Fernand Léger painting were in the process of being deconstructed and anatomized. The drawing fairly vibrates with movement. There is a logic to the way Schutz makes paintings. It stands to reason that if people devour themselves, then they'll have to find a way to reconstitute their disappearing bodies. Paintings like New Legs and Twin Parts show you how that process would work. In Twin Parts, a pair of conjoined figures surrounded by scattered and stacked tables is choosing various clay-like shapes to attend to their combined bodies. They are an awkward work in progress. In a fine poetic essay on Schutz and her work, Barry Schwabsky argues that it's at the point of uncertainty that painting finds its greatest leverage. Schutz's self-reformers embody that uncertainty. It is telling how often this idea of building occurs in her paintings. She focuses on human activities that take place in sequence, but which she compresses as overlapping simultaneous events. A painting method that displays an ongoing process of assembly and reassembly would find a congenial model in a modified cubism. Cubism employs spatial simultaneity, while Schutz is interested in temporal simultaneity, in collapsing into a single apprehension actions that would normally take place over time. So in Getting Dressed All at Once, we see a woman trying to put on her socks, blouse, pants, and shoes in the same gesture. It's an impossible task. Bed Parts, which was on the cover of Border Crossings number 134, is a sort of benign Frankenstein cubism. It takes a body in bed and disassembles it. We see arms and knees and feet and hair and buttocks all rearranged in ways that are compact and confusing. The painting is composed of angles, vectors, and openings into which body parts fit, a penetration which implies a dimension existing beyond the surface. The wide open eye at the top left of the painting is the mechanism for seeing that other dimension. All these works underline a logic of construction that has been at the core of her work since 2011. In two recent large paintings, Assembling an Octopus from 2013 and Building the Boat While Sailing from the year earlier, she's focused on a group of people doing the same thing. In one, a number of would-be artists are drawing an octopus on a beach, and in the other, a motley crew of non-sailors are building, without benefit of tools, the very ship on which they intend to sail. It is the raft of the Medusa from 1818, reimagined as the Love Boat. Instead of desperate and dying shipwrecked sailors hanging dangerously over the edges of their raft, the group in Schutz's painting seems to be happily, if ineffectively, constructing their vessel as they go. Some are spouting water like human seals, a woman splashes her feet in the ocean, and a pair of men appears to be hoisting a sail. The atmosphere is more carnival than catastrophe, and even though you're not sure they will get their boat built, you have no worries that anyone will be in danger if they don't. There are some recognizable artists on board, including Jackson Pollock and Bruce Nauman, so it's possible to see Building the Boat While Sailing as an allegory of painting itself. As she told us in an interview, the painting was meant to be about the process of making it up as you go along. I didn't want them to be using tools, so they're using their bodies to build the boat. You can't tell if she's inventing or appropriating any more than you can tell if her figures are working or relaxing. The questions you can ask run the gamut of how much is she floating on Jericho's raft? How much of the rigging is being brought into service by Picasso, who's helping a figure set the mainsail? How much the sense of energy in the line has been aided by Jackson Pollock, who uses his leg as a level to measure a board on the right-hand side of the composition? These are questions specific to this painting, but they can apply to her work in general. In one sense, they're as rhetorical as the poetic question posed by Yeats in Among School Children. How can you know the dancer from the dance? You can't. They're inseparable. Figure and movement, idea and object, form thought, and painting made.
In Paris in 2011, at the Jeu de Paume, we saw an exhibition of photographs by Claude Cahun. It wasn't the first time I'd looked at and considered her work. Once seen, it's not forgotten. It also brought to my attention her extraordinary book, Disavowals, which had been published in 1930, but in English not until 2007. In its own most particular use of language, it seems to me to have presented a form almost as unique as Gertrude Stein's, not so much in Cahun's case for the form only, as for the pointed, searing really, meaning her style carried. In 1938, Claude Cahun, who had been born Lucy Schwab, and her stepsister Marcel Moore, whose birth name was Suzanne Malherbe, moved from Paris to Jersey in the Channel Islands. In 1940, both were arrested, jailed, and sentenced to death for resistance work they had engaged in against the Nazis who occupied Jersey that year. The stepsisters were remarkable in every way as artists, lifelong companions, lovers, and sisters. Their individual and collaborative works were shown for the first time in 1993 at the Jersey Museum. The publication of Cahun's biography, written by François Leperlier in 1992, began the ongoing exhibition of Cahun's work internationally, and it continues. In my essay on Cahun in a special issue we published on photography in 2011, I'd noted that feminist studies, renewed interest in performative art, and engagement with the mutable definitions of gender, and the myriad ways in which photographs are made and read, had prepared a fertile and ready ground for the reception of the work of Cahun and Moore. It was seen as avant-garde then, and is still current and relevant now. The avant-garde was indeed where Cahun wanted to be, on the edge, at the very front, and advancing. She'd written, "Only with the very tip would I wish to sew, sting, kill. The rest of the body, what comes after, what a waste of time. Only ever travel in the prow of myself." Her goal, to pare away to a fine point the problematic gendered body. She used the mirror in photographs to reflect and present her image, seeking an affirmation of presence, and also looking back from a distance at the viewer, and in the case of one of the most immediately recognized of her works, self-portrait in a boldly checked shirt, at her companion Marcel Moore, who would have been the camera's operator. Looking at the image and reading what she had written, it was my sense that behind the glass, beyond it, or through it, in the wafer-thin space where the image briefly rests, or on which it is imprinted, resides the anomalous, unattainable destination in transit. However thin, I'm thinking of this space as operating in the realm of contingency, a brief, transitory imminence. In the second elegy of the Duino elegies, Rilke once again conjures the angels, the same about whom he had asked in the first, "What angel, if I called out, would hear me?" He tells us they are suddenly, singly mirrors, drawing back into their faces the very beauty they've spilt. In other words, they're offering nothing. Doubled and closed off, solipsistic and unavailable in their self-reflection, taking back through the glossy surface of the mirror their own beauty as though it were a surfeit they might have shared, and again, I suggest, even though barely measurable, perhaps immeasurable, unemptied space. In Cahun's transformative practice, in this earliest performance work with her identity unfixed, and in the conflicted relationships to the space her body occupied, in the transit from one persona to the other, and the indeterminacy or flux of gender naming, and in the nature of the writing itself, I see immanence, the always ready act and transformation.
I don't regard this wholesale embrace of uncertainty as an admission to defeat or a recognition of entropy, the world winding down to bring T.S. Eliot back into the mix, and ending not with a bang but a whimper. Rather, uncertainty is a realization that the verities, those enduring truths of the past, simply don't exist. As Charlene von Hale remarked in our painting issue last year, the hierarchical thinking we have about art is changing. There is no avant-garde anymore. It is more about choosing. Uncertainty is not an easy way out. In fact, it isn't a way out at all. It is the promise or the necessity of an ongoing engagement. In an ironic inversion, it recognizes failure or indeterminacy as a catalyst. You must make something because what you've already made doesn't provide the answers you've been seeking. So Philip Guston recognizes that painting is impure. It's the adjustment of impurities which forces painting's continuity. As Jake and Dinos Chapman say, failure is an inherent part of making art. You attempt so much knowing the final work will end up a poor shadow of your intentions. Again, let me use a rhetorical device and say what this uncertainty is not. It is not a conscious aversion of painterly effects and strategies, the finished product disguised as a preliminary stage, major painting masquerading as minor painting, as Raphael Rubinstein identified in his characterization of provisional painting. This is not slacker painting or intentionally bad painting. There is no aesthetic self-sabotage here. Dana Schutz wants to make good paintings and not good, bad paintings.
Elaine Stocky is a Winnipeg photographer now living and working in Los Angeles. She received her undergraduate degree from the University of Manitoba, studying with David McMillan and Larry Glosson. Her graduate degree is from Yale, where she worked with Todd Papageorge and Philip Lorca de Corsia, among others. Both Papageorge and de Corsia have produced work as street photographers, a form Stocky says she would also love to employ, but is too internal to do. What she does in her work, which I think is wonderfully eccentric and unique, is orchestrate a photographs event in the way de Corsia did, or rather, with a similar end idea in mind. Where de Corsia, in his noted body of work titled Heads, would set up a camera on a street and have a radio signal from the shutter set off the lights that gave the image what has been described as providential lighting, a lighting not unlike Caravaggio's in, for example, The Calling of St. Matthew, where a door thrown open focuses a sudden and unexpected light on the subject. Elaine Stocky also sets the drama, but in another way. When we interviewed de Corsia in 2008 and talked with him about this work, he assured us that everyone was setting up photography now. That, and also, as he said, the idea of narrative, especially a kind of elliptical narrative, has entered the photographic language and is shouting down pretty much anything else. Stocky's photographs, in many cases, are oblique narratives. Something is happening, is about to happen, will happen if we can think what it is. For her work, she engages actors, locates them in sets and settings she has chosen, provides simple props and some directions, and then her camera. The subjects are real, as far from the cool, emotionally uninflected work of photographers like Rennie Dykstra and Tina Barney as she can make them. In an article in Border Crossings in 2011 written by Daniel Baird, she'd said, "I think the deadpan look of photographers like Tina Barney doesn't reflect human experience. I don't think that kind of work is surprising or interesting. I think it's boring. I take offense at seeing art that is entirely divorced from real human experience." The delight, the weight, and the significance of Stocky's photographs reside in the space between your recognizing her characters as just plain everyday people and the almost transcendent sense of wonder you experience, or most certainly I experience, in determining what it is they mean in her work. Her use of space is otherworldly, as is her choice of lighting. In hand, two couples are close dancing. One couple eclipses the other in part. In the tilt of the bodies, you feel the music and their joy in dancing to it. Where the wall meets the ceiling, there is a deep red line, but in the photo, it cuts diagonally, almost at midpoint across the image. So while the couples have their feet on a horizontal, unseen floor, the diagonal sets their bodies in a happy, rhythmic off-centeredness. In the foreground, one partner's hand, resting on the other's shoulder, absorbs Stocky's arranged light and inflates it like a large glove. She wants and does feel a close emotional connection to her subjects. It's the lack of distance between herself and others, and between the inner and outer she intends her photographs to convey. Where I feel immanence enters is in the seemingly mute or silent spaces she creates, in how the work is read formally, in how it looks, and in the transit of spatial pauses where their possible meaning resides. The epigraph to E.M. Forster's novel, Howard's End, is only connect. It sprang to mind.
Dana Schutz has said that she's influenced more by individual paintings than by painters, so her engagement is a selective one. But it is an engagement nonetheless. Painting, like any artistic discipline, is an inescapable conversation with the past. I've used the word discipline both as an area of study and a necessary way of approaching that study. Making art, writing poetry, film directing, pick any art form you want, is a discipline, and anyone who thinks it is not demanding is not thinking. Talent isn't enough. It helps, but it only gets you so far. The best artists we know in Winnipeg and everywhere else are incredibly hard workers. It is what they do and who they are. I'm reminded that in our most recent issue, Chantal Joff says that painting is her identity. Without it, she doesn't exist. The American painter Jim Dine told us 20 years ago that he was ruthless at getting the art out. I've always done what I had to do. I don't think it's ever hurt anyone, but I would hate for anyone to stand in my way. I mean that. His affirmation about the need for personal commitment turned into an uttered threat. Dine's uncompromising honesty in that interview underlines one of the reasons why we have such respect for the artist and the artist's voice in border crossings. We're constantly made aware of the costs, physical, psychic, and material, involved in being a serious artist. Everything is on the line. It's no exaggeration to say that artists wear their hearts on their sleeves. We've made it our role as critics not to be the jackdaws whose pecking completes Shakespeare's famous line. Our approach to the act of criticism is to come at it with intelligence, flexibility, and generosity. The easiest criticism to write is the excoriating kind. When you set your sights on damnation, the words come faster and more slippingly on the tongue. The devil's party is certainly more enjoyable than the angel's congress. Responsible criticism is an act of commensurability. Its desire is to enter the artist's imaginative frame and to find there a condition of equivalent openness and empathy. Without it, criticism is an act of self-indulgent, easy narcissism. Under Mika's editorship, the pages of Border Crossings are crammed full of the opposite of that mean-spiritedness.
I want to consider some additional artists, among them filmmaker and painter Harmony Korine, and also a cluster of artists we talked with in the current painting issue. In their variety, they all seem to be addressing issues of art making, painting primarily, and some of the ideas in Boris Groys's book On the New struck me as applicable. Their concerns were voiced in the questions they take into their studios, which, for us, made evident how germane was our sense and theirs of provisionality and immanence in their work. We're using provisionality here as accompaniment or antecedent to immanence, the sense, time, or place of anything's being possible. In his films, Spring Breakers, Gummo, Trash Humpers, and Julian Donkey Boy, Harmony Korine is giving us back our contemporary culture. I identify him as both cultural seer and commentator, not that his fictional films are seen by him as being in any way traditional or documentary. They would find ready categorization within the realm of the profane, as Groys identifies it, consisting of everything that is valueless, nondescript, uninteresting, extracultural, irrelevant, and transitory. However, he says it is here, in the realm of the profane, that valorized culture seeks potentially new materials, suitable to be included, archived, and structured as cultural memory and housed institutionally in libraries, museums, and universities. Groys refers to Baudrillard and the hyperreality of the modern world, which simulates the real, making it realer than real, and the example Baudrillard gives is Disneyland. Groys has selected to footnote this quote from Baudrillard. Disneyland is presented as imaginary in order to make us believe that the rest is real, whereas all of Los Angeles and the America that surrounds it are no longer real, but belong to the hyper-real order and the order of simulation. Without the application of theory, this is what Harmony Korine has done. He's made Spring Breakers, his most recent film, in neon candy colors, an aqua underwater forever, with highlights of magenta and an orange sherbet sun that is always on high. It's what Robert identified in his introduction to the interview we published this year as neon noir, and about which Harmony says, "I want the movies to wash over you, to go through you, to create a kind of sensory bombardment. I've been trying to get this idea of a liquid narrative, a free-form storytelling where time is exploded and colors become characters." Explicit in an explosion of time and a transposition of color is some kind of kinesthetic transformative possibility. Now Greuze once more. Neither innovative art nor innovative theory can be described and justified on the basis of its relationship of signification to reality or, but it comes to the same thing, to truth. The question, he goes on, is therefore not whether they are true or untrue, but rather whether they are culturally valuable. And as though in response, except it was border crossings he was talking to, Harmony Korine says, none of the art I make is based on truth. I'm trying to get to something that has to do with transcendence, or an energy, or some kind of fucked up vapor. I want it to work in a physical way. Trash Humpers is an extremely difficult film to watch, but you can't take your eyes off it. About the three fully distasteful characters in it, Korine spoke with admiration, describing them as poets of horror and mayhem. With affection, he commented that they elevate evil in a way that makes it almost great. And while he isn't interested in truth as a virtue, in response to being asked if there were anything he wouldn't do in a film, he said, I don't really know. I never put limits on anything. I'm not really worried about it because I know my intentions are pure.
The Montreal-born American painter Philip Guston seemed like two painters to the artists who attended his infamous opening at the Marlborough Gallery in New York in 1970. Up until that exhibition, he was a revered first-generation abstract expressionist, along with de Kooning, Pollock, Motherwell, and Rothko. Guston was a delicate and subtle abstract painter, and in comparison, the craggy, awkward, figurative paintings he showed in 1970 seemed an unforgivable apostasy. His friend, the avant-garde composer John Cage, asked him in bewilderment, how can you leave that beautiful land? Among his contemporaries, only de Kooning was supportive. The break was so dramatic that art historians distinguish between two periods. There is Guston, and then there's the late Guston. But as is often the case with shifts in a painter's style, the reasons for it and the ways they get from one place to another are traceable within the artist's production. Guston himself commented on the impossibility of living entirely in the moment without the tug of memory. He realized that we are image makers and image-ridden. In Guston's world, being image-ridden is a good thing. His observations about Piero della Francesca, who along with Rembrandt was inspirational, are perceptively poetic. A different fervor, grave and delicate, moves in the daylight of his pictures, he said. He's like a visitor on earth. In comparison, Guston was Antaeus, touching the gritty and piecemeal earth was his salvation and place of reinvention. He told Harold Rosenberg, I should like to paint like a man who's never seen a painting, but this man, myself, lives in the World Museum. He said that a painting should be like a magnificent ruin. He considered that a shape or a painting was finished when it's been everywhere that I can think of, but just momentarily. That is to say, it must then feel as if it could go somewhere else. It's just pausing, which is, of course, the promise of continuity. The promise of continuity, of course, is the achievement of immanence. That promise was observable as Guston moved from his early abstractions through to the brutish and hard-won paintings of the mid-60s, in which black shapes sit on top of agitated and scumbled gray and pink grounds. These paintings, with names like Painter, Looking, Group, and Portrait, are clear transitions to the figurative works he began in the late 60s, where hooded, cigar-smoking Klansmen begin as marauders and end up as surrogate artists and critics. In Scared Stiff from 1970, a worried Klansman looks at a looming and accusatory finger on the right-hand side of the painting. The pointing has the same drama that Caravaggio achieves in his Calling of St. Matthew. In Painter's Head, an oil done in 1975, you can see all Guston's registers. A bloodshot-eyed, smoking figure looks at a drawing of a single line pinned to a wall. Below it are the backs of stretched canvases. The smoke from his cigarette hangs in space like one of the gray shapes in his paintings from the mid-60s. And the head of the figure, a self-portrait to be sure, sits on top of a lovely bluster of eggshell, white inflected with a tinge of pink. His body could easily have been painted 25 years before his head. For Guston, being a painter was being involved in an unending, baffling chain which never seems to finish. What works for Guston works for Guy Madden and Dana Schutz as well. She has a series of verb paintings in which three things happen at once, like swimming, smoking, crying, from 2009. In 1973, Guston painted a figure lying in bed and smoking, considering a painting of a stack of shoes with a plate of French fries on the bed beside him. The oil is called Painting, Smoking, Eating. As the character named Bent, a prison break gardener in Madden's The Forbidden Room, says, nothing is ever the past.
Looking at art in museums, galleries, in books and periodicals, it would be impossible not to note a preponderance of a certain kind of work which is most evident in painting. It's new, but carries references and traces of the past, a traditional oil on canvas, but it includes additional elements like wax, charcoal, collage, silkscreen, digital, and transfer prints. Or it's oil on canvas dated 2015, but heavy with reference that include cubist and surrealist tropes. Cultural critic David Gears published an essay, Neo-Modern, in the winter 2012 issue of the journal October, where he noted what he identifies as a return to modernism, impelled, he suggests, by the uncertainty and anxiety of the current period. To this he adds artists pushing back against the proliferation of commodity art with slick production values, a certain nostalgia for the hand and craft, and a weariness in response to art which has readily accommodated theoretical readings. He calls this return to modernism neo-formalism, and while he says that it draws influences from a range of art antecedents, from constructivism to arte povera, he sees it being closer to action painting with its emphasis on process and abstract form, and in its use of a broad range of material and images. In the most recent issue of Border Crossings, we published a 30-page section we called The Uncertain Certainty, States of the Art of Painting. It took the form of interviews because our sense was that the questions and the responders' honest attempts at finding answers would provide a fuller presentation of the immanent state between certainty and uncertainty that inhabits every artist's studio. We talked with Israeli-born artist Tal R., who lives in Copenhagen, to New York-based painter Amy Silman, currently living in Berlin, to London-born New York-based painter Cecily Brown, to Alison Cates from Montreal, now living in London, England, to New York-based American painter David Sally, and to Montreal-born painter Melanie Otier, living in Ottawa. As indicated in the section's title, none was seeking certainty, all sought engagement in an ongoing process, and entering or invited into each working space was a daunting, sobering, or challenging measure of self-doubt. Amy Silman was quite clear and apparently comfortable, indicating, for me, play is an openness to being mutated. The things that interest me are anxiety, instability, and change. When Alison Cates was asked if she sought certainty in her work, her answer was, no, I think doubt is the pleasure. It's where that allowance happens of being able to linger and have it bring up a whole host of questions about ability and perception and meaning. And David Sally, who has been making paintings for almost 50 years, responded to a question about the complicated internal logic of his paintings, saying simply, personally, I don't find them complicated, or rather, I find something less complicated to be less than satisfying. All the artists with whom we spoke welcomed indeterminacy and saw doubt as a generative condition. What other population offers itself up willingly to sustained high-wire tension and declines a safety net below?
In a revelatory interview conducted by Harold Rosenberg in 1965, Philip Guston talked about a wished-for place which was only made available to him through painting. It's a place that promises a future particularity of this indecision, this hovering. In a word, it promises future creation. In an earlier interview, he had said, painting permits ultimately the joys of the possible, but the narrow passage to this domain of the possible suppresses any illusion of mastery. As it went for Guston, so it goes for us. Sojourners in the unmastered, immanent domain, we can arrive at possible conclusions, but there are no endings. Only beginnings hover in front of us. Thank you. I don't know what I'd say.
No questions. No questions.
No question. That's what bewildered. Thank you very much. Maybe we'll have a drink outside.